Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Wine Learning with the Wine Doctor. My name is Jesse McLean. I am a doctorate of nursing practice and a French wine scholar. And today we're going to be discussing the region of Champagne. So starting off our wine journey in the region of Champagne, while discussing Champagne, I'll start off with a few factoids that you may or may not have known about the region. But Champagne itself was mentioned 36 times in the series of James Bond movies, including Bollinger being mentioned the most. The coupe glass was always believed to be shaped after Marie Antoinette's breast, but in fact that is not true whatsoever. Marie Antoinette lived from 1755 to 1793, and the coupe glass was invented by the English in 1663. So it's that saucer-like champagne glass that you see at parties. Yeah, that was not designed after Marie Antoinette. So that story, in fact, is false. Now, the three grapes most made out of Champagne, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay. Two of those three grapes are, in fact, red grapes. So most of your white champagne is made from red grapes. And Marilyn Monroe's famous bubble bath scene where she filled up their bathtub with champagne, 350 bottles of the bubbly was used to fill her bathtub. The Champagne region, located in the northeast of France, is the most northern of all the wine regions in France, located between the 49th and 49.5 parallel, away from the equator, and the 50th parallel is actually the highest limit where the vine is able to grow in all of Europe. And it's a 90-minute drive east of Paris. So for those of you that have traveled to Paris, maybe you've traveled over just a little further east to the wine region of Champagne. Champagne shares a continental climate with maritime influences. So basically it has a very cold winter, and the maritime influences brings a lot of frost. So what you may see sometimes during the fall or even spring season is a lot of fires in the vineyard trying to debride or get rid of that frost. Cold and harsh weather only account for 1,650 hours of sunshine per year. So, that being said, it is a very difficult climate to grow grape and make wine. The main wine growing regions in Champagne are Montagne de Reims, which grows primarily Chardonnay, but also we'll find Pinot Meunier and Pinot Noir. Vallée de la Marne, Pinot Meunier is predominantly grown here. Côte de Blanc, Chardonnay. Côte de Blanc, Hill of White, Chardonnay. And Côte de Saison, Chardonnay. And finally, Côte de Bar, where you'll find Kimmeridgian marl-type soil, where Pinot Noir seems to thrive. From the 9th century to the 16th century, you basically had Gouais Blanc, Gouais Noir, and Fromenteau, which is now known as Pinot Gris, as your grape varieties in the region of Champagne. However, from the 16th century to its present day, Pinot Noir is the dominant grape located in Champagne with 38% of the vine, Pinot Meunier 34%, and Chardonnay is 28%. Now, how they make Champagne is a special art. So the Champagne method, or méthode champenoise, traditional method, one of those three types of terminology may be used. And even outside of the region of Champagne, though they're not using the word champagne, they may say made in traditional method or made in méthode champenoise. Basically, they make a base wine production. So they make wine like we all know how to make wine. Then they blend together, assemblage. They blend the base wine together to get the blending agent that they would prefer. Tirage, or bottling. They then put the base wine production into the bottle. And then they seize the foam, or prise de mousse. They seize the foam within the bottle. Remouage, riddling, where people will use A-frame racks to maybe riddle it, or now in modern time, a lot of these vineyards mechanize their riddling. So basically it slowly turns the bottle in order to get the lees or the yeast to the neck of the bottle. Disgorgement, they freeze the neck of the bottle to freeze those lees or the sediment basically, and then they dosage, and once they get rid of that yeast or lees, they top it off, or dosage, putting the right amount of more base wine and sugar, depending on how sweet they want to make their champagne, which is the brut, sec, demi-sec, the different words based on the sugar content that they would prefer in their wine. So now we're going to talk about each of those steps a little more detail. So the base wine production, grapes are intentionally picked with less sugar because they're going to be adding sugar and they're going to be doing a lot of things with the wine. So they don't want the Brix to be too high. They go through 2 fermentations, and the higher sugar initially, then the higher alcohol. And alcohol kills yeast, and they don't want that. They press the wine, and the press they use is usually very wide and very flat because they don't want the skin contact. Because again, as stated before, 2 of these 3 wine grapes that they're using in the wine are red, and they want their champagne most of the time, unless they're making a rosé, they want it white. So they want less skin contact. Now, contrary to popular belief, Dom Perignon did not invent champagne, but he is credited with creating the cuvée, or the blend, where he took the 3 grapes, blended them together to give it a unique flavor. Base wines, basically your Pinot Meunier, your Pinot Noir, and your Chardonnay, are blended together in order to make it consistent from year to year, depending on what you prefer. Whether you prefer Bollinger, Taittinger, or Dom, they blend it together based off of what Dom Perignon is credited with. So the next step in the champagne method is bottling, or tirage. Now, the act of bottling is unique in this region because they will blend those wines together, as we just discussed, put it in the bottle, and then they add yeast or sugar, mix it together, and then they cap it, almost like with those old soda glass bottles with the cap. They cap it with the yeast and sugar mixed together. Now, this yeast and sugar that mix together is the second fermentation, which creates the sparkles, okay, or seizing the foam. It creates essentially 4.5 to 6 atmospheres of pressure, so quite a lot of pressure within inside that bottle. So that when you add the sugar and you add the yeast, you're basically creating that second fermentation, because the first fermentation was done with the base wine production a few steps before, your initial step within the champagne method. Now, once you've seized the foam inside the top of that bottle, what you need to do now with these A-frames is what's called remouage, or riddling. So basically the champagne bottle goes upside down into these, and then the old act was to slowly turn them every so often in order to get all that sugar, yeast, all that lees and sediment to fall into the neck of the bottle right here. Now, in the modern day, a lot of it is mechanized. So you'll see a ton of bottles in like a big square mechanized device, and the mechanization slowly turns that device, as opposed to hiring riddlers in order to turn the bottle up every day. Now, once you get all the lees, the yeast, the sediment, as you can see in the base neck of this bottle, then what they need to do is disgorgement. So once it's all down at the bottom, they'll freeze that cap, open it, and it shoots out this chunk of ice rather quickly, and that's the disgorgement process. So they remove that cap, and firing out because of all the atmospheres of pressure in that bottle is what creates that disgorgement. Now, the dosage with the disgorgement, once that cap goes flying out, there's space left in that bottle, because keep in mind, you had froze a section of that wine and the yeast and all the sediment there. So there's a gap there. So then that's when you sweeten up the wine. So if you're making a brut, or if you're making a sec or demi-sec, there's different dosage you may add to that bottle, which includes basically topping up that bottle, the base wine plus a little sugar, depending on your preference and what kind of style of champagne you're making. Now, the sweetness scale, as you'll see on many bottles, brut nature, extra brut, extra dry, dry, sec, demi-sec, doux. Doux being the sweetest, brut nature is basically as dry as you can get. Most people think brut is the most dry. Well, in fact, it's somewhere right in the middle, actually. But it basically tells you how much residual sugar, 0 to 12 grams per liter residual sugar for brut, and so on. So be sure, if you are using this as a study guide, brut nature is 0 to 3 grams per liter, extra brut, extra dry / sec, demi-sec, and doux 50 plus grams per liter. So that is basically like soda. Now, the fascinating thing is sometimes the label of the champagne bottle will tell you everything you need to know about the champagne bottle, such as the vintage. If it's non-vintage, there won't be a year. If it's vintage, there's a year. Blanc de Blanc, so basically it's a white champagne made from white grapes, or Blanc de Noir, a white champagne made from black or red grapes. The sweetness will be listed on there, Brut, Sec, Doux, but also 2 letters which will describe what kind of wine producer made the champagne. So some of these are very, very hard to find and very small. But if you look at the bottom, and I have a few slides up ahead, but if you look at somewhere on the label, you'll see these NM, RM, CM, MA. Basically, it could be on the front, could be on the back, usually followed by a bunch of numbers, but it is visible somewhere on the label. So as discussed, when it says vintage champagne, a year will be listed on there. So this Bollinger is a blend from 2011 grapes. Okay, so it says 2011 on there. Whereas if you have a non-vintage champagne, like the Chateau de Bligny, there's no year listed on the label, so that's non-vintage. If it's vintage, it totally must be made from grapes grown during the stated vintage. So if it says 2011, it has to be from 2011. Non-vintage is blended over several years so they can have more control or have the same flavors that you and I have grown to love. Blanc de Noir, again, sparkling wine made from black grapes. So those are your Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier. And Blanc de Blanc is made from Chardonnay, your only white grape in that region. So again, going back to that wine label, as you can see on this Veuve Clicquot, real small at the bottom there, you see NM, or basically Negociant Manipulant. So a person or champagne house is a Negociant Manipulant, where they buy the grapes, the grape must, or still wine, and make their own champagne under their own label. So that is a Negociant Manipulant, or a champagne house. Now, a Récoltant Manipulant is basically they make their own champagne from their own grapes, so a grower-producer. So again, the Chateau de Bligny, the Green Bay Packers champagne from the region of Champagne, as you can see on the label right here, RM is a Récoltant Manipulant, so a grower-producer. So a few other common initials you may see is CM, or Cooperative de Manipulate. Cooperative seller that basically makes grapes from its members. So the members send this house grapes to make wine. So it could be from many different growers, essentially. A Récoltant Cooperateur is a grower, brings the grapes to a co-op, which vinifies them or makes them into wine. And then the grower takes it back, their own product, back to their winery and puts a label on it. So you, with all the equipment, make my wine for me, make my champagne for me, and then I'll sell it or I'll label it. You'll see a RC on the label. Or a Marqué Auxiliaire is a private label registered to any group. So basically, if you think of like a $2 Chuck, that would kind of fall under a MA in the champagne world. So a tête de cuvée is basically the cream of the crop, the best of the best. So for Moet and Chandon, it's Dom Perignon. So basically, it is the first press. So they have these big, wide, flat presses, and they press a certain amount of wine, and then that first, up to a certain liter, that is the tête de cuvée, or the cream of the crop. They take that, and that is only for Dom, and then they continue to press, and then that makes your other Moet and Chandon or Moet and Chandon Rosé. All right, the cream of the crop is only made during vintage years. So your tête de cuvée, you're not going to get a vintage Dom Perignon year after year, but only the best years will they make it. So that's why you may see a few years gap in between vintages. So again, a few things to know. Dom Perignon, again, did not invent champagne, but he did and is credited with the blending of it. The invention of the champagne is actually given to the monks at Saint Hilaire, but again, Dom is credited with the cuvée. One of my favorite things that my buddies like to razz me about when the topic of champagne does come up is the movie Wayne's World, where Benjamin does say, in a way to try and impress Cassandra, that champagne, all champagne is French. It's actually named after the region. Otherwise, it's sparkly white wine. Though Benjamin is correct, there are a few exceptions, which we'll get to in the next slide. But for the most part, if it's sparkling wine made outside of the region of Champagne, you'll see words as Cremant, sparkling, cava, prosecco, sect. Those words essentially means sparkling or bubbly. But what you may see sometimes is champagne method, traditional method, méthode champenoise, basically stating that they use the same method that the region of Champagne does, but they're not allowed to call it champagne. So that method, those steps with tirage, assemblage, disgorgement that we talked about in a few slides before, that is the méthode champenoise, or the traditional method. So in 1892, the Madrid Agreement, which is basically an international trademark agreement, stated that trademarks do cross international waters. However, the U.S. did not agree until 2005, and some of that still remains unsettled as to who's allowed to use the word champagne and who's not. The American government agreed that California champagne would no longer appear on domestic wine labels unless a producer was already using that name. So up until 2005, if they were already saying champagne, they can continue to do it. But after 2005, not allowed. So if they use this name prior to March 10th, 2006, then they were permitted to continue to use it indefinitely. So occasionally you will see some labels that say California champagne. Basically that just means they were using it before March 10th, 2006. All right, so the big question, how do I open this bottle safely? Well, that's a great question, okay? The key is chill the bottle. So if your champagne is chill, you have less likelihood of it flying all over the place and making that popping sound that we love, but that's actually a great waste of good wine. If you pop it too loud and if it sprays all over the place, you don't want to do that. So you chill it in the fridge for a little bit, in a bucket of ice for a little bit, dry it off, make sure you have a good grip of the bottle. You don't want it wet and slipping all over the place. I always get a towel, wrap it around the top. All right, so you twist the cage. As we all know, the cage is there. You open it, you twist it 6 times. 6 times opens up the cage. You don't have to take the cage off, but you can put the towel over it. All right, you don't have to remove the cage, just make sure it's loose enough. And then when you hold the bottle at a 45-degree angle, so you hold it at a 45-degree angle and you turn the bottle, not the cork, the bottle, while you're holding the cork in place. Okay, again, do not turn the cork, okay? So one of my instructors in class always says, when you open that bottle, you should not hear a pop. You should hear the whisper of an angel as opposed to the fart of a whore. So keep that in mind. So to kind of recap for those individuals that may be using this to help study for a certification, Champagne is the northernmost vine in France. Anything higher, it cannot grow. So it's that 49 to 49.5 parallel. Make sure you know the sweetness scale from Brut Nature all the way down to Doux. So make sure you know the sweetness scale. The current grapes in Champagne are Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay, 2 of 3, which are black grapes or red wines. Make sure you know your label nomenclature. The négociant manipulant, récoltant manipulant, NMRM are usually the most common, but make sure you know the others as well. Make sure you know the Champagne method or the traditional method or méthode champenoise. And make sure you know how to safely open a champagne bottle. Sometimes you have to do it outside, sometimes you do it inside. But if you chill it, dry it, turn the bottle, not the cork, you should be okay. All right, I appreciate you guys tuning in. Stay tuned, we're going to be doing another region here shortly. Have a good one.